You are sitting in the turret of a Panzer, engine idling, watching smoke columns rise from the beaches just 10 miles away. Through your binoculars, you can see them. Over 338,000 Allied soldiers, trapped against the sea, waiting to be annihilated. Your division has covered more ground in 3 weeks than the entire German army managed in 4 years of the last war. Nothing stands between you and the total destruction of the British Expeditionary Force. Then the radio crackles. An order comes down from the highest level. Stop. Do not advance. Hold your position. You will sit here for 2 full days while the enemy slips away across the channel. The question of why that order was given has haunted military historians for 80 years. Tonight, we're climbing inside the minds of the German commanders who watched their greatest victory sail out of reach. The date was May 24, 1940. Germany had just accomplished something no military strategist believed possible. In less than 2 weeks, their panzer divisions had sliced through the Ardennes forest, shattered the French defensive line, and driven a steel wedge between the British and French armies. Now the entire British Expeditionary Force, the professional corps of Britain's army, the men who would be needed to defend the island itself, were squeezed into a shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. The German High Command could taste the victory. General Guderian's tanks were closer to Dunkirk than the bulk of the retreating British troops. The Allies had their backs to the sea. There was no escape. Every German commander in the field understood what came next. A final armored thrust to crush the pocket, capture over 300,000 men, and effectively knock Britain out of the war in a single afternoon. This was not speculation. This was the unanimous assessment of the men holding the guns. So when the order came down to halt the advance, the reaction in the forward command posts was not just confusion. It was fury. Field commanders screamed into radio handsets. They begged for permission to roll forward those final 10 miles. They watched through their field glasses as British soldiers waded into the surf, as destroyers and fishing boats began appearing on the horizon, and they understood with sickening clarity that the greatest encirclement in military history was being thrown away. For 80 years, that halt order has remained the most controversial decision of the Second World War. Was it a catastrophic military blunder driven by infighting among German commanders? Was it a calculated strategic gamble that simply failed? Or did the answer lie somewhere deeper, in the psychology of the men who believed they had already won? Tonight, we are going inside the German war machine at the moment of its supreme triumph and its most inexplicable failure. We're going to hear the arguments, read the secret communications, and stand beside the panzer commanders as they watched 400,000 men sail away. Because the truth about what happened at Dunkirk is not the story you learned from history class. It is a story of ego, exhaustion, and a miscalculation so profound it changed the course of human history. To understand how the German High Command threw away its greatest opportunity, you have to rewind 3 weeks. In early May 1940, the world believed the German army was about to replay the First World War. All the intelligence suggested a slow, grinding advance through Belgium, exactly as the Schlieffen Plan had attempted in 1914. The French had built the Maginot Line specifically to prevent that. The British had sent their expeditionary force across the Channel, fully expecting to fight a defensive war of trenches, artillery barrages, and attrition. Every Allied commander was confident they had months to react. They were wrong. On May 10, 1940, German forces crossed the borders of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. But this was not the main attack. The northern thrust was a feint designed to draw the best Allied divisions racing northward into Belgium to meet it. While they rushed forward, the real hammer was swinging through a place no one thought a modern army could move: the Ardennes forest. 60 miles of narrow, twisting roads, dense woodland, and steep ravines. The French High Command had dismissed it as impenetrable to armored divisions. One French general had called it the best tank obstacle in Europe. But the German General Staff had spent months studying every contour, every bridge, every potential bottleneck. And they had placed their finest armored commanders in charge of pushing through it. The man leading the charge was General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg Doctrine. He had spent the 1930s arguing that tanks should not be scattered among infantry as support weapons, but concentrated into independent armored divisions that could punch through enemy lines and drive deep into the rear, destroying command centers, supply depots, and the enemy's will to fight. The conservative generals mocked him. They called his ideas reckless fantasy. But Adolf Hitler, who loved audacity when it served his purposes, had seen Guderian's panzer demonstrations and authorized the creation of dedicated panzer corps. Now Guderian was commanding the 19th Panzer Corps, and he was about to prove his doctrine in the most spectacular way possible. The panzers entered the Ardennes on May 10th. The roads were barely wide enough for a single tank. The column stretched back for over 100 miles, bumper to bumper, moving at walking pace through the forest. If a single Allied bomber had caught them there, packed together with no room to maneuver, the entire offensive could have been crippled in an afternoon. But the Allies were looking north, toward the decoy attack in Belgium. So the panzers crept forward, hour after hour, through the dark corridors of pine and shadow, until they burst out of the forest near Sedan on the Meuse River. The crossing of the Meuse on May 13th and 14th was the decisive moment of the entire campaign. The French had fortified the far bank with concrete pillboxes and artillery positions. They believed the river would hold for at least a week. Guderian gave them 1 day. He concentrated his tanks, artillery, and Stukas in a coordinated assault that shattered the French defenses within hours. The German infantry crossed in rubber boats under heavy fire. Engineers threw pontoon bridges across the river while under bombardment. By the evening of May 14th, the panzers were across. The road to the English Channel was open. What followed was one of the most dramatic advances in military history. Guderian's Panzer Corps turned west and raced across northern France, covering up to 50 miles a day. They bypassed strongpoints. They ignored their flanks. They refueled at captured French petrol stations. The columns moved so fast that the German High Command itself could not keep up with their positions. French units surrendered en masse, completely bewildered by the speed of the attack. The German tanks would appear on the horizon before anyone had even reported their presence. One French general described it as an armored avalanche. By May 20th, Guderian's lead elements had reached the coast at Abbeville, near the mouth of the Somme River. The Allied armies were now cut in two. The entire British expeditionary force, along with the best divisions of the French army, were trapped in a pocket that stretched from the Channel coast to the Belgian border. They were squeezed from the north by the German Army Group B advancing through Belgium, and from the south by Guderian and the other panzer corps of Army Group A racing up the coast toward the Channel ports. The only question was which port they would be able to reach. The most critical was Dunkirk, the last major harbor still in Allied hands. The German High Command could scarcely believe its own success. At the Führer headquarters, there was near euphoria. Hitler was ecstatic. His generals, who had initially been terrified of the risks, now competed to claim credit for the breakthrough. But in the field, a different dynamic was emerging. The panzer commanders were pushing their men and machines to the absolute limit. The tanks had been advancing continuously for nearly 2 weeks with minimal maintenance. Engine failures were mounting. Treads were wearing out. Crews were hallucinating from exhaustion. The infantry divisions that were supposed to protect the panzer flanks were still far behind, marching on foot along roads choked with refugees and destroyed French vehicles. Meanwhile, the Allied forces in the pocket were not simply waiting to be captured. On May 21st, the British launched a counterattack near the town of Arras. It was a desperate, thrown-together assault with limited tanks and infantry, but it caught the Germans off guard. The British Matilda tanks had armor thick enough that German anti-tank guns could not penetrate them. The attack was eventually stopped by hastily deployed 88mm anti-aircraft guns pressed into anti-tank rolls, but it sent a shock through the German command. It suggested that the Allied armies, despite their desperate position, still had sharp teeth, and it reinforced a fear that had been growing in the minds of some senior German generals, especially the commander of Army Group A, Generaloberst Gerd von Rundstedt. Gerd von Rundstedt was one of the most respected officers in the German army. He was 64 years old, a Prussian aristocrat with a reputation for cold, calculating judgment. He had served in the previous war and understood better than most how quickly fortunes could reverse on the battlefield. He had watched the panzer divisions race far ahead of their supporting infantry. He had seen the casualty reports and the tank readiness figures. He knew that the French still had substantial forces south of the Somme, and he was already thinking about the next phase of the campaign, the drive on Paris. In his view, the panzers were a precious resource that should not be squandered on a mopping-up operation around Dunkirk. Let the infantry finish the pocket. The armor needed rest and refit for the decisive battles to come. On the morning of May 24th, von Rundstedt met with Adolf Hitler. The Führer had flown to the Army Group A headquarters at Charleville to discuss the situation. What was said in that meeting has been debated ever since, but the outcome is not in dispute. Von Rundstedt recommended that the panzer divisions halt their advance along the line of the AA Canal, just 10 miles from Dunkirk. The infantry divisions of Army Group B, coming from the north, could complete the encirclement. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had been lobbying Hitler with a competing promise. His air force alone could destroy the trapped Allied forces. The panzers were not even necessary. The pocket could be smashed from the air. Hitler, who distrusted his army generals and was eager to give his loyal paladin Göring a share of the glory, was receptive. He confirmed the halt order. The order went out that afternoon. The panzer commanders on the ground reacted with disbelief. Guderian protested furiously, receiving only a curt reply that he was to hold his position. General Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanding the 41st Panzer Corps, personally drove to the front to confirm that he was not being asked to stop within sight of the enemy's last escape route. He was told in no uncertain terms, "The order comes from the top. Do not advance." The men in the forward positions could hear the rumble of explosions from Dunkirk. They could see the smoke. They knew what was happening, and they were forced to sit and wait. But here is the thing that almost nobody talks about. The halt order was not completely irrational. The terrain around Dunkirk was not ideal for tanks. It was crisscrossed with canals, drainage ditches, and flooded fields. The panzers had already taken significant losses, both to enemy action and mechanical breakdown. Von Rundstedt's conservation argument had genuine military merit, and the Luftwaffe had demonstrated shocking effectiveness throughout the campaign. There was reason to believe that bombing alone might be enough to prevent a large-scale evacuation. What nobody in the German command fully appreciated was the determination of the Royal Navy and the sheer improvisational genius that the British were about to unleash. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation plan, was already being set in motion from the other side of the Channel, and the weather was about to turn against the Luftwaffe in ways no one could have predicted. So now, as the sun set on May 24th, the German army stood at the threshold of total victory. The panzers were fueled, armed, and positioned for a final push that would annihilate the British army. But the engines remained silent. The order stood, and across those 10 miles of Belgian and French countryside, over 330,000 men were being organized, loaded onto ships, and carried away to fight another day. The halt order would remain in effect for 2 days, and when it was finally lifted, the window of opportunity had closed forever. The trap had been sprung, but the prey was already escaping. The question of why, exactly, that order was given and who was truly responsible would destroy friendships, end careers, and generate a mystery that still has not been fully answered. But to understand the full depth of the disaster, we need to climb inside the tank, stand beside the men who were forced to watch the evacuation, and hear from the commanders who screamed into their radios while history slipped away. The forward observation post of the 1st Panzer Division sat on a low ridge overlooking the Ea Canal. Through their field glasses, the German tank commanders could see the spires of Dunkirk's churches rising above the flat Flemish landscape. The distance was almost nothing. A tank could cover it in an hour. Private Karl Mayer, a radio operator attached to Guderian's forward command, later recalled the moment the order arrived. The radio crackled with a priority message from Corps headquarters. The operator transcribed it and handed it to his lieutenant with a shrug, assuming it was the expected permission to advance. The lieutenant read it. Then he read it again. His face went pale. He walked to the company commander and spoke in a voice so low that Meyer had to strain to hear. "We are ordered to halt in place. No advance. Repeat, no advance." The reaction was not silence. It was a surge of angry, disbelieving voices. Men clustered around the radio truck, shouting questions. "Is this a mistake? Verify the code. Ask for confirmation." The confirmation came back with a tone of cold finality. "The order is from the top. Hold your position until further notice. Do not engage unless attacked." The men who had raced across France, who had slept in their tanks and eaten cold rations for 2 weeks, who had seen the enemy reeling and broken before them, were now being told to stop and watch the enemy reorganize. One Panzer crewman later wrote in his diary, "We could see the transport ships beginning to gather offshore, tiny dots that meant salvation for the Tommies. We could see it with our own eyes, and we could do nothing." That night, the fires from Dunkirk were visible for 40 miles. The German forward positions were close enough that the wind carried the smells of burning oil, cordite, and salt water. Nobody slept. Officers stood in clusters around map tables, tracing the same routes over and over, updating their own positions, measuring the distance to the port. 10 miles, maybe 12 to the beaches. The enemy had no meaningful defenses in front of them, only exhausted rearguard units with anti-tank rifles that could not penetrate German frontal armor. The path was open, and yet the engines remained cold. To understand what was happening in the higher reaches of the German command, you have to appreciate the strange, poisonous atmosphere that had developed between Adolf Hitler and his generals. The victory in France was supposed to have been the German General Staff's triumph. They had designed the plan, refined by General Erich von Manstein, that had broken through at Sedan. The conservative Old Guard had initially resisted Manstein's audacious scheme, but once Hitler had endorsed it and the results had proven spectacular, the Führer claimed credit as his own strategic genius. In his headquarters, Hitler was now surrounded by sycophants who reinforced his growing belief that he, not his generals, possessed the decisive military intuition. The generals, in turn, resented this usurpation of their authority, but they were trapped in a system that demanded absolute loyalty to the man who held supreme command. This dynamic would shape every decision made in the final week of May. On the morning of May 24th, as the halt order was being transmitted to forward units, a small drama was unfolding at the Führer's temporary headquarters near the Belgian border. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, had requested an urgent meeting. Göring was a man of gargantuan appetites, a First World War fighter ace who had transformed himself into a political creature of immense vanity and ambition. He had watched the army generals basking in the glory of the French campaign with barely concealed jealousy. The Luftwaffe had performed brilliantly in support of the army, but the public narrative belonged to the panzers. Göring saw the Dunkirk pocket as his opportunity to reclaim the spotlight. His message to Hitler was simple and seductive. "Let my air force finish them. The army need not risk a single tank or soldier. I will bomb the British into the sea." Hitler was predisposed to listen. He had never fully trusted the conservative army leadership, which he viewed as politically unreliable and mentally trapped in the trenches of the previous war. Goering was a loyal National Socialist, a member of his inner circle, and a man who had delivered on previous promises. But there was more to Hitler's thinking than mere favoritism. He was genuinely concerned about the condition of the panzer divisions. The reports from the front described alarming losses. Some divisions were down to 50% of their original tank strength, not just from enemy action but from mechanical failure. The fast advance had left the supply and repair echelons far behind. And then there was the terrain. The area around Dunkirk was crisscrossed with drainage canals, ditches, and flooded fields, a landscape that had been intentionally inundated by the Belgians years before, as a defensive measure. Tanks would be forced onto narrow causeways where they could be picked off by anti-tank guns. Von Rundstedt, the man Hitler respected most among the generals, had made this argument forcefully. Why risk the irreplaceable panzer divisions in a swamp when the infantry and the Luftwaffe could complete the job? There was also a deeper, more speculative factor that historians have debated for decades. Hitler had expressed to several confidants that he did not want to utterly humiliate Britain. He admired the British Empire, which he saw as a stabilizing force in the world and a potential future ally against the Soviet Union. He told General Hans Jeschonek that the blood of a single Englishman was too valuable to shed, that the two peoples belonged together racially and traditionally. This was not mercy in any humanitarian sense. It was a cold political calculation. If the British army was destroyed at Dunkirk, the humiliation would make it impossible for any British government to negotiate peace. If they were allowed to escape, perhaps a faction in London would see reason and agree to terms, leaving Germany free to turn east without a Western front. This theory remains controversial, and many historians dismiss it as a post-war rationalization by German generals seeking to shift blame, but it aligns with statements Hitler made before and after the event. The halt order, then, was not simply a single man's whim. It was the product of converging pressures. Von Rundstedt's cautious military logic, Göring's opportunistic ambition, Hitler's political calculations, and his desire to assert authority over his generals, and the genuine exhaustion of the panzer divisions. All of these threads wove together to produce a decision that, from the perspective of the men in the turrets, was simply incomprehensible. While the German commanders debated and the panzer crews fumed, something remarkable was beginning on the other side of the Channel. In the Admiralty Building in London, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay had received orders on May 20th to prepare an emergency evacuation from the French coast. The operation was codenamed Dynamo after the dynamo room in the Dover Cliffs that served as his headquarters. Ramsay was a meticulous planner, but he was under no illusions about the difficulty. The port of Dunkirk was already under heavy air attack. The harbor facilities were being destroyed. The beaches stretched for miles, shallow shelving sands that would prevent large ships from approaching, and the number of troops that needed to be saved was far beyond anything that had been attempted in modern warfare. The initial estimate was that perhaps 45,000 men might be rescued over 2 days. After that, the German noose would tighten and the window would close. Ramsay began assembling a fleet. The Royal Navy provided destroyers, minesweepers, and transports. But destroyers could not beach themselves. They needed smaller craft to ferry soldiers from the shore to the ships waiting in deeper water. The Admiralty put out a call, and the response became one of the most celebrated episodes in British maritime history. Over 800 civilian vessels, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, river ferries, lifeboats, and barges were requisitioned or volunteered by their owners. Men who had never been to sea in anger, retired fishermen, weekend sailors, teenage sea scouts, set out across one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world to rescue an army. They did not know about the halt order. They only knew that the German army was closing in and that time was running out. The first evacuations began on May 26th, while the German halt order was still partially in effect. But the Luftwaffe had not been idle. Göring had promised to destroy the pocket, and his bombers were pounding the port facilities day and night. The town of Dunkirk was reduced to rubble. Thick, black smoke from burning oil tanks hung over the harbor like a funeral pall visible from the English coast 70 miles away. The smoke, however, had an unintended consequence. It provided cover from the dive bombers. The German pilots, flying through the haze, struggled to identify targets on the ground. And then there was the Royal Air Force. Contrary to the complaints of some British soldiers who felt abandoned, the RAF was flying hundreds of sorties over the beaches, engaging the Luftwaffe in savage dogfights above the evacuation. They lost over 100 aircraft, but they prevented the German bombers from having a clear run at the crowded beaches. Between the smoke, the RAF, and the cloudy weather that limited visibility, the Luftwaffe was unable to deliver the knockout blow that Göring had so confidently promised. On the German side, the halt order was finally rescinded on the evening of May 26th, but the damage had been done. The two-day pause had allowed the British to organize a defensive perimeter, a thin but determined line held by rear guard units who understood that their sacrifice was the price of the army's survival. When the panzers began to roll forward again, they found not a chaotic rout but a stiffening resistance. The roads were blocked with abandoned vehicles and craters. The causeways were covered by anti-tank guns and determined infantry. And above all, the moment of psychological shock, the panic that might have disintegrated the Allied command, had passed. The men on the perimeter knew what they were fighting for. They were buying hours for their comrades to reach the ships. Guderian, who had been forced to watch helplessly for 2 days, now pushed his divisions forward with furious urgency. But the opportunity for a clean breakthrough had vanished. His leading elements reached the outskirts of Dunkirk on May 29th, but by then the evacuation was in full swing. The beaches were thronged with tens of thousands of soldiers, waiting in orderly queues that stretched into the water. The Royal Navy had improvised a system using the breakwater, a long wooden pier that allowed destroyers to come alongside and load directly, dramatically increasing the rate of evacuation. The little ships ferried men from the beaches to the larger vessels, making shuttle runs under constant shell fire and bombing. The organization was ragged, exhausting, and astonishingly effective. It was not until May 30th that the German High Command fully grasped what was happening. Their intelligence reports had been fragmentary and contradictory. They had assumed that the British could not evacuate more than a fraction of their force, that the troops on the beaches were doomed no matter what. One German staff officer later described the moment of realization as a cold shock. They had intercepted radio signals, prisoner interrogations, and aerial reconnaissance photos that showed an armada of small ships shuttling men off the beaches. The numbers were staggering. By May 31st, over 126,000 men had been lifted from the harbor and the beaches. The German command scrambled to intensify air attacks and push the panzers harder, but the window was closing. The rear guard was fighting with desperate courage at every bridge and crossroads. The weather continued to be uncooperative, with low clouds grounding much of the Luftwaffe on critical days. The evacuation continued until the early hours of June 4th. The final ships pulled away from the breakwater, loaded with French troops who had held the perimeter to the last. Behind them, the beaches were littered with abandoned equipment. Thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, tanks, motorcycles, and mountains of ammunition and fuel. The rear guard, some 40,000 French soldiers who had fought to the last round, were captured. But the army had escaped. The final count was 338,226 men, including 139,000 French and Belgian troops. It was more than 7 times the number that the Admiralty had initially hoped to rescue. The panzers that had been halted 10 miles from the coast had been denied the greatest prize of the campaign. In the aftermath, the German propaganda machine declared Dunkirk the greatest German victory ever. The official narrative was that the British army had been driven into the sea, that the Channel ports were in German hands, and that the French campaign was effectively won. Hitler spoke of France suing for peace within 3 weeks. The German public was told that the Wehrmacht had achieved a historic triumph, and in a narrow territorial sense, it had. The British Expeditionary Force had lost all its heavy equipment. Over 68,000 men had been killed, wounded, or captured during the battle. The French army was shattered. Paris would fall within weeks. But the propagandists could not admit what the generals in private already knew. The professional corps of the British Army had survived. The men who would train the next generation of soldiers, who would form the nucleus of the forces that would return to the continent 4 years later, were alive. And Britain, far from being cowed, was galvanized. On June 4th, as the last ships docked in England, Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons. He did not pretend that the evacuation was a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, he said. But then he delivered the words that would define British resolve. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. The words were broadcast, printed, and repeated until they became the psychological armor of a nation. The German High Command, listening to the speech, understood with varying degrees of clarity that the strategic situation had changed in a way that their maps and casualty figures could not capture. Inside the German officer corps, the post-mortem began almost immediately. General Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff, recorded his frustration in his diary. The pocket should have been liquidated in 48 hours. The opportunity was thrown away. Guderian, who had been the most vocal critic of the halt order during the battle, spent the rest of his life returning to the moment. In his post-war memoirs, he called it a decisive mistake, one that had the most disastrous influence on the whole future course of the war. Von Rundstedt, for his part, remained publicly unrepentant. The panzers needed rest. The terrain was unsuitable. The Luftwaffe was supposed to finish the job. But in private conversations, later in the war and after, he acknowledged the bitter irony. We had the enemy in the palm of our hand, he confided to an aide, and we let him go. The question of ultimate responsibility would never be settled to everyone's satisfaction. At the Nuremberg trials and in post-war memoirs, the surviving German commanders constructed a careful narrative. The blame, they suggested, lay primarily with Hitler. It was the Führer's interference in military operations, his favoritism toward Göring, his political delusions about British capitulation. The generals in this telling had been overruled by an amateur tyrant who had seized the credit for their victories and now had to own the defeats. There was truth in this, but it was an incomplete truth. Von Rundstedt himself had advised the halt. The Army High Command had not protested with the vehemence the situation warranted, and Göring's boast had been accepted not just by Hitler, but by many in the military who had come to believe in the Luftwaffe's invincibility. The failure was not a single man's error. It was a systemic collapse of strategic judgment produced by the toxic interaction of military caution, political ambition, and a command structure that had concentrated too much power in too few hands. But there is a dimension to this story that goes beyond the maps and the memoirs. It is the experience of the men on the ground, the German soldiers who sat in their tanks and watched the evacuation lights on the water, the British and French troops who stood in waist-deep surf waiting for boats that might never come, the civilians who sailed their little ships through minefields and strafing attacks. To truly understand what happened at Dunkirk and why the halt order mattered, we have to descend from the command posts to the foxholes, from the admiralty rooms to the cockpits of the bombers that streaked low over the burning beaches. Because history, the kind that shapes the fate of nations, is always made by individuals making decisions in moments of exhaustion, terror, and stubborn hope. Inside the turret of Panzer No. 213, Corporal Wilhelm Fischer pressed his forehead against the rubber eyepiece of his gun sight and watched a destroyer pull away from the Dunkirk breakwater. It was loaded so heavily with men that its decks were black with bodies. Fisher could see them through his magnification, tiny figures packed shoulder to shoulder, some waving, some simply lying still from exhaustion. His gun was loaded. The range was within his effective envelope. He had clear line of sight. He requested permission to fire. The response came back from company command. Negative. Hold position. Awaiting orders. Fisher later told a war correspondent that he sat there for 3 hours, tracking one ship after another through his sight, never pulling the trigger. He said it felt like being a spectator at your own execution. The ships were leaving. The enemy was escaping. And the finest tank in the world had been reduced to an observation post. The frustration in the forward units was not limited to the enlisted men. Colonel Hermann Balck, commanding a motorized infantry regiment attached to Guderian's corps, was a man not given to theatrical complaints. He had won the Knight's Cross in the First World War, and would go on to become one of the most decorated officers in the German army. On May 27th, he personally drove forward in an armored car to assess the situation. What he found infuriated him. His men were dug in along the canal line, exchanging sporadic fire with a thin screen of British defenders. Beyond the defenders, he could see the evacuation beaches through his binoculars. They were swarming with troops, thousands upon thousands of them, loading into boats in an operation that looked chaotic but was plainly effective. Balck radioed division headquarters and demanded permission to attack. He was told the order to hold was still in effect. He slammed the handset down so hard he cracked the receiver. In his memoirs, written decades later, the bitterness was still fresh. We could have taken Dunkirk with a battalion. Instead, we sat and watched history being stolen from us. But while the front-line commanders raged, the higher headquarters was embroiled in a drama of its own. The relationship between Hitler and his senior generals, already strained, was deteriorating under the pressure of the halt order controversy. General Franz Halder, the Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, had been aghast at the halt order from the beginning. His diary entries from those days read like a man watching a slow-motion train wreck. On May 24th, he wrote, "The Führer is obsessed with the idea of not risking the panzers in the Flanders marshes. Von Rundstedt confirms this view. Göring promises the Luftwaffe will finish the job. I consider this a disaster." On May 25th, the halt order continues. Guderian reports the enemy is boarding ships. We must act now, or the opportunity is lost forever. Halder was not a confrontational man. He was a staff officer, a meticulous planner who preferred the orderly world of maps and timetables to political confrontation. But over those days, his frustration built to a point where he considered direct insubordination. What Halder and the Army High Command did not fully grasp was the degree to which Hitler was now listening to a different set of voices. At the Führer headquarters, a shadow council had effectively formed around the person of Hermann Göring. The Luftwaffe commander had flown to the front personally, establishing himself at a forward command post where he could claim proximity to the action. He sent a stream of messages to Hitler, each one more confident than the last. "The British are trapped with their backs to the sea. My bombers will smash them to pieces. The Navy cannot possibly evacuate more than a fraction. Give me 3 days of clear weather, and there will be nothing left to evacuate." The messages were exactly what Hitler wanted to hear. They confirmed his instinct to preserve the panzers. They promised a victory that would belong to the Air Force, diluting the glory of the army generals, whom he increasingly resented. And they came from his most trusted paladin, the man he had personally elevated to command the skies. But the weather did not cooperate. The North Sea and the English Channel are fickle bodies of water in late May. A series of low-pressure systems moved through, bringing cloud cover, rain, and reduced visibility. The Luftwaffe's bombers could not operate at full effectiveness. The dive bombers, the feared Stukas that had terrorized refugees and soldiers alike during the advance, found the clouds too low for their attack profiles. They needed to dive from several thousand feet to achieve accuracy. With a ceiling of a few hundred feet, they were forced to make shallow, ineffective runs. The level bombers, Heinkel He-111s and Dornier Do-17s, dropped their payloads from higher altitudes, but the smoke from the burning oil tanks and the general haze made target identification difficult. Bombs fell into the sea, into empty dunes, into the rubble of the town. Many of them missed the crowded beaches entirely. And then there was the Royal Air Force. The German pilots had been told the RAF was a spent force, its best squadrons destroyed in the battles over France and Belgium. This was a catastrophic underestimation. Fighter Command, under the direction of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, had carefully conserved its strength. Dowding had resisted the pleas of the French to commit his last reserves to the lost battle on the continent. He was thinking ahead to the defense of Britain itself, but over Dunkirk, he committed enough. Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons were rotated through the airspace over the evacuation, flying combat patrols that engaged the German bombers and their fighter escorts in running battles that lasted from dawn to dusk. The British pilots were operating at the edge of their range, with only minutes of combat time over the beaches before they had to turn for home. But they made those minutes count. German bomber crews, who had grown accustomed to operating with minimal interference, suddenly found themselves under attack from fast, heavily armed fighters that appeared out of the haze without warning. The losses mounted. Between May 26th and June 4th, the Luftwaffe lost over 130 aircraft, destroyed or damaged. The RAF lost a similar number, but the strategic calculus was different. Every German bomber shot down over Dunkirk was a bomber that would not be available for the coming battle over England. Every German fighter pilot who parachuted into captivity was a trained specialist who could not be replaced. On the ground, the British perimeter was holding with a stubbornness that surprised the German infantry. The defense was not elegant. It was improvised, desperate, and patchwork. Units that had lost contact with their parent commands found themselves attached to ad hoc formations under officers they had never met. French troops, who had been dismissed by some German commanders as demoralized and broken, fought with extraordinary courage at key points. At the town of Lille, a French force of 40,000 men held out against 7 German divisions for 4 critical days, pinning down forces that could otherwise have been thrown against the Dunkirk perimeter. The German commander, General Alfred Wegener, was so impressed by the French defense that he allowed the surviving defenders to march into captivity with their weapons, a gesture of military respect that was vanishingly rare in that war. But perhaps the most remarkable element of the evacuation was not the military operation, but the civilian one. The little ships of Dunkirk have become a symbol, polished smooth by decades of retelling, but the reality behind the symbol is worth examining closely. The Admiralty's requisitioning of civilian vessels was not a romantic appeal to volunteerism. It was a desperate improvisation by a navy that did not have enough small craft to ferry troops from the beaches. The owners of motor yachts, fishing trawlers, and pleasure boats were not all volunteers. Many were conscripted along with their vessels, told to report to assembly points where naval personnel would take over. Others did volunteer, and some of them paid with their lives. The crews were a strange mixture of naval reservists, professional fishermen, weekend sailors, and teenage sea cadets. They crossed the channel in convoys, navigating by dead reckoning through sea lanes that were mined and patrolled by German E-boats. They arrived at beaches that resembled a scene from a nightmare: smoke, fire, the constant crump of artillery, and lines of exhausted men stretching into the water. They loaded their boats until the gunwales were inches above the waterline, then turned and made the crossing again, and again, and again. One of these civilian vessels was the Sundowner, a 58-foot motor yacht owned by Charles Lightoller, a retired naval officer who had been the second officer of the RMS Titanic. Lightoller was 66 years old in 1940. He had survived the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, lowering lifeboats and eventually finding himself in the freezing water before being pulled aboard a collapsible boat. When the Admiralty requisitioned the Sundowner, Lightoller refused to hand her over. Instead, he took her himself, along with his eldest son Roger and a teenage Sea Scout named Gerald Ashcroft. They crossed the channel, navigating through the debris and the bombing, and reached the beaches. Lightoller, applying the same calm competence that had served him in the North Atlantic 28 years earlier, packed 130 men onto a boat designed for 21. He got them back to England. The Sundowner survived the war, and Charles Lightoller, who had watched the Titanic go down with 1,500 souls, had helped save an army. The stories from the beaches themselves are a catalogue of human extremity. Men stood in lines that stretched into the water for hours, sometimes up to their necks, waiting their turn to board a boat. They did this under shell fire. The German artillery had the range of the beaches, and the shells came in at irregular intervals, throwing up geysers of sand and water. The psychological discipline required to stand still in a queue while shells were landing nearby is almost impossible to describe. Veterans of Dunkirk interviewed decades later often struggled to put it into words. They talked about a kind of detached calm, a fatalism that settled over them like a blanket. Some men prayed, some joked, some simply shut down, retreating into a mental space where the horror became abstract, like watching a film of something happening to someone else. The destroyers that came alongside the breakwater were targets of concentrated German attention. The East Mole, a long wooden pier, allowed ships to dock and load directly, but it was fully exposed to the German guns. Destroyer captains learned to load until they could load no more, then pull away and make the run for Dover at maximum speed. On the return crossing, the ships were attacked by E-boats and submarines. The French destroyer Bourrasque was sunk by a mine on May 30th with heavy loss of life. The British destroyer HMS Wakeful was torpedoed on May 29th. More than 600 men died. The destroyer HMS Grafton was torpedoed while rescuing survivors from the Wakeful. The Grenade was sunk by air attack at the harbor entrance. The destroyer captains kept coming back. They knew what was at stake in a way that the German High Command, with its maps and its telegrams, did not. These were not just numbers on a situation report. These were the men who would defend the island in the battle that everyone knew was coming. In the German forward positions, the men who had been forced to halt were keeping their own vigil. The accounts from German soldiers who watched the evacuation are a neglected corner of the historical record. They are not stories of triumph. They are stories of helplessness, confusion, and a growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong. One Panzer gunner, Hans Müller of the 10th Panzer Division, described the experience in a letter to his wife that was later published in a collection of German war correspondence. "We can see the Tommies on the beaches. There are so many of them, like ants on a disturbed nest. The ships come and go, come and go. Our officers say the Luftwaffe will deal with them, but the ships keep coming. I do not understand why we are not attacking. The men are angry. They feel we are being cheated of our victory." The letter was never mailed. Müller was killed 3 weeks later in the drive toward Paris, but it was found among his effects and preserved. It is a window into a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. Soldiers who had been told they were part of an irresistible force discovering that they were, in fact, being held back by decisions made far from the battlefield. The German military censors worked hard to control the narrative. Soldiers' letters home were screened for any suggestion that the halt order had been a mistake. The official press reported the encirclement of Dunkirk as a crushing victory, the greatest encirclement battle of all time. The propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels produced newsreels showing columns of British prisoners, captured vehicles, and the triumphant advance of German forces. The footage was real, but the framing was deceptive. The prisoners shown were largely the rear guard, and the wounded who could not be evacuated. The abandoned vehicles were genuine, the fleet of trucks and tanks that the British had destroyed before boarding the ships. But the essential fact that the army had escaped was simply omitted. The German public was not told. The soldiers at the front could see the truth with their own eyes, but the channel of communication back to the homeland was controlled. What makes this chapter of the story so revealing is the way it exposes the fault lines within the German command structure. The halt order was not simply an error of judgment. It was a symptom of a deeper dysfunction. In a healthy military organization, a decision of this magnitude would be debated openly, the dissenting views would be heard, and the final order would reflect a synthesis of the best available advice. But in the German High Command of 1940, power was distributed in a way that made this impossible. Hitler held supreme operational command, a role that no competent military system would assign to a head of state. The Army High Command under Halder and von Brauchitsch was nominally responsible for the conduct of the ground war, but their authority was constantly undermined by Hitler's direct interventions. Göring, as head of the Luftwaffe, reported directly to Hitler and answered to no one else, meaning the Air Force operated according to its own priorities rather than as part of a coherent joint strategy. Into this vacuum stepped the personalities. Von Rundstedt, the old Prussian, cautious and calculating, focused on the next campaign rather than the current one. Göring, the political animal, obsessed with prestige and the credit he could claim. Hitler, the supreme egotist, convinced of his own strategic genius and deeply suspicious of the generals he had been forced to rely on. Each of them had a piece of the truth. Von Rundstedt was right that the panzers were tired and the terrain was poor. Göring was right that the Luftwaffe was a formidable force that could inflict terrible damage. Hitler was right that the campaign was essentially won and that preserving strength for the final blow made strategic sense. But the aggregate of these partial truths was a complete falsehood. The combination of these perspectives, mediated through a dysfunctional command structure, produced a decision that was less than the sum of its parts. And the price of that failure was paid in the blood of the German soldiers who had to fight the same enemy again, 4 years later, on the beaches of Normandy. The halt order also illuminates something fundamental about the nature of military command. Decisions in war are made under conditions of radical uncertainty. Commanders must weigh incomplete information, competing priorities, and unknowable future consequences. The mark of a great commander is not the absence of error, but the ability to recognize and correct error before it becomes catastrophe. By this measure, the German High Command in May 1940 failed utterly. The halt order was issued on the assessment that the British could not escape. When evidence began to accumulate that they were escaping, the order was not immediately rescinded. When it was finally lifted, the delay in communicating the new orders to forward units further eroded the remaining opportunity. The machinery of command, which had functioned with such lethal precision during the advance, had seized up at the critical moment. Perhaps the most damning detail of all is one that only emerged years after the war. On May 30th, when the full scale of the evacuation was becoming apparent, General Alfred Jodl, the Chief of Operations for the Armed Forces High Command, noted in his diary that the Führer was in excellent spirits. Hitler had spent the morning reviewing plans for the drive on Paris. The Dunkirk situation in his mind was already resolved. The British were beaten whether they escaped or not. The French campaign was practically over. The future belonged to Germany. He was, in a sense, already living in the post-war world he imagined, a world in which Britain would see reason and come to terms. The evacuation was an operational detail beneath his strategic notice. And so the man with the authority to change the outcome did not even recognize that the outcome had changed. On the beaches, the evacuation continued through the first 3 days of June. The rear guard, by now composed almost entirely of French troops, fought with a tenacity that deserves to be remembered. They knew they would not escape. They knew they were fighting for time Not for their own lives. They held the perimeter through the night of June 3rd, and as dawn broke on the 4th, the last ships pulled away from the East Mole. Behind them, the beaches fell silent. The Luftwaffe arrived in force that morning to find only abandoned equipment and the small, scattered figures of prisoners being rounded up by the German infantry, who had finally broken through the perimeter. The Battle of Dunkirk was over, but the history of what happened after the battle, the legacy of the halt order and the evacuation, is where the deeper story truly lives. Because the consequences of those 10 miles that the panzers did not drive would ripple outward through the rest of the war. They would shape the Battle of Britain, the defense of Egypt, the planning of Operation Overlord, and the eventual liberation of Europe. And they would poison the internal politics of the German High Command, creating recriminations and blame games that would last until the final collapse of the Reich. To understand why Dunkirk mattered beyond the beaches, we have to follow the men who survived and the commanders who failed into the years of war that still lay ahead. The British Army that evacuated from Dunkirk left behind its equipment, but it took with it something that the German High Command had fatally undervalued: the institutional memory of how to fight a modern war. Those 338,000 men were not simply bodies. They were the trained nucleus around which an army of millions would be built. Every sergeant who had learned how to coordinate infantry and armor under fire. Every lieutenant who had discovered that the German blitzkrieg was terrifying, but not supernatural. Every radio operator who had heard the panicked calls of units being overrun and survived to process the lessons, they all came home. They were not beaten men. They were angry, grieving, exhausted men, but they had seen the worst the Wehrmacht could deliver, and they had lived. In the training camps of Britain over the next 4 years, they would teach the next generation exactly what they had learned. The numbers tell a story that the German propaganda could not erase. The British Expeditionary Force had suffered 68,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured. That was a grievous loss, but the German plan had been to inflict total annihilation. Against that objective, 68,000 was a failure. More than 250,000 British soldiers were now behind the coastal defenses of southern England, re-equipping, reorganizing, and preparing to repel the invasion that everyone expected. The German invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, depended on the premise that the British Army had been effectively destroyed on the continent. The Luftwaffe's coming assault in the Battle of Britain was predicated on the same assumption. Both would be proven wrong because of the men who had walked onto the boats at Dunkirk. The German generals who had been most vocal in their criticism of the halt order would spend the rest of the war living with its consequences. Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Panzer breakthrough, never forgave the interference that had stalked him at the A Canal. In the summer of 1941, he would lead his Panzer Group into the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. He would achieve staggering successes, encircling entire Soviet armies in battles that made Dunkirk look like a skirmish. But the lessons of May 1940 had not been fully absorbed by the high command that sent him. Once again, the Panzer commanders would find themselves halted by orders from above, forced to divert their forces to secondary objectives while the enemy escaped encirclements. In the vast spaces of Russia, the consequences would be even more catastrophic. The Red Army would learn, adapt, and eventually produce their own blitzkrieg, but this time in reverse. Guderian would be dismissed by Hitler in December 1941 for retreating without authorization, and although he would be recalled later in the war, the breach of trust between the Führer and his most gifted panzer commander never healed. The experience of watching the British escape at Dunkirk also colored the German command's assessment of their enemy for the remainder of the war. There is a specific psychological error that afflicts military organizations that come close to total victory and fail to achieve it. They tend to underestimate their enemy's resilience, telling themselves that the escape was a fluke, that the next battle will finish the job, that the opponent is fundamentally beaten and just needs one more push. This era would recur repeatedly in German strategic thinking. Before Moscow in December 1941, German intelligence would dismiss reports of Siberian divisions massing on the flanks because the Red Army was supposedly already destroyed. Before Stalingrad, the German command would ignore evidence of a massive Soviet buildup on the flanks because the city was supposedly about to fall. Before Normandy, the German High Command would convince itself that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais because the Allies could not possibly risk a landing in bad weather on the Norman coast. Each of these episodes shares a DNA with the Dunkirk assessment. The enemy is beaten. The evidence does not matter. Our will alone will determine the outcome. The most immediate consequence of the Dunkirk evacuation was felt in the skies over southern England just 6 weeks later. On July 10, 1940, the Luftwaffe began its campaign to achieve air superiority over the Channel and the British coast. This was the preliminary phase of the Battle of Britain. The German air crews who flew over England were among the finest in the world. They had honed their tactics over Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. They had every reason to be confident. But the fighter pilots of the RAF who rose to meet them were not starting from scratch. Many of them had flown over Dunkirk. They had tested themselves against the Luftwaffe in desperate conditions and had discovered that they could hold their own. The lessons of the evacuation, the tactics for engaging German bomber formations, the weaknesses of the Stuka dive bomber, the importance of radar-directed interception had all been validated in the skies over the Channel. The Battle of Britain was not fought by novices. It was fought by men who had been forged in the crucible of the French collapse and had come home to fight another day. The British Army's survival also had immediate strategic consequences far beyond Europe. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. The French had surrendered. The Soviet Union was bound by a non-aggression pact with Germany. The United States was neutral, its public deeply opposed to entering another European war. In this context, the defense of the Mediterranean and the Middle East became critical. The British garrison in Egypt, which guarded the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East, was heavily reinforced with units that had been evacuated from France. The men who had waded into the surf at Dunkirk found themselves, within months, facing the German Afrika Korps in the Western Desert. The battles of Tobruk, El Alamein, and the final expulsion of Axis forces from North Africa were fought and won by an army whose core had been saved from destruction in May 1940. If the Panzers had closed the trap, the British would have faced the campaigns of 1941 and 1942 with a fraction of the experienced manpower they actually deployed. The strategic arithmetic is stark. No Dunkirk evacuation, no Eighth Army. No Eighth Army, no victory in North Africa. No victory in North Africa, no invasion of Italy. The dominoes fell forward from the beaches. And then there is the most obvious consequence of all. On June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy began. The supreme commander of the operation was General Dwight Eisenhower, an American. The ground force commander was General Bernard Montgomery, a Briton who had commanded a division during the retreat to Dunkirk. Many of the battalion commanders, brigade commanders, and staff officers who planned and executed the Normandy landings had been junior officers in France in 1940. They understood the German army's strengths and weaknesses at a visceral level. They had seen the blitzkrieg from the receiving end, and they had spent 4 years figuring out how to defeat it. The field marshal who commanded the German defenses in the West was Gerd von Rundstedt, the same man who had recommended the halt order. He was now an old man, 70 years old, repeatedly overruled by Hitler in the same dysfunctional pattern that had produced the Dunkirk decision. The panzer divisions that might have made a difference on the beaches of Normandy were held in reserve under Hitler's personal control, exactly as the panzers had been held back at the AA Canal. The historical irony is almost unbearable. The German High Command had learned precisely the wrong lesson from its own victory. They believed the Führer's intuition was the decisive factor, and so they gave him even more direct control, with the predictable result that when the real invasion came, the armored reserves sat idle for critical hours while the Atlantic Wall was breached. The psychological dimension of Dunkirk is harder to quantify, but perhaps even more significant. Wars are not won solely by material and troop numbers. They are won by belief, by the conviction that victory is possible, and that the sacrifice will be worth it. The Dunkirk evacuation was an extraordinary boost to British morale at the moment when morale was most needed. The British public, which had been bracing for news of a catastrophic defeat, instead heard that the army had been saved by a fleet of little ships crewed by ordinary civilians. The story was so powerful that it transcended its factual details. It became a national myth, a proof that the British character of stoic improvisation and quiet courage would prevail against the mechanized might of the Nazi war machine. The effect on American public opinion was also significant. The images of the little ships and the stories of the rescue helped shift American sentiment away from isolationism. It became harder to argue that Britain was doomed when the evidence of its resilience was so vivid. The political groundwork for Lend-Lease, the American program of military aid that would keep Britain in the war, was laid in part by the emotional impact of the Dunkirk story. But what about the German side? What happened to the men who were forced to halt, who watched the ships come and go, who understood in their bones that an opportunity had been squandered that would never return? Their stories are the hidden half of the Dunkirk legacy, and they are not comfortable stories for anyone who prefers simple narratives of good and evil. The German soldiers of 1940 were not all Nazis. They were a mix of conscripts and volunteers, enthusiasts and skeptics, ideologues and ordinary men caught in the machinery of a criminal state. Many of them believed sincerely that they were fighting for their country, that the conquest of France was a just revenge for the humiliations of Versailles, that they were the leading edge of a new European order. The halt order shook some of that faith. Not all of it, and not for all of them, but the experience of watching a trapped enemy escape because of the incompetence of their own leadership planted a seed of doubt that would grow as the war dragged on and the victories became less frequent. Corporal Wilhelm Fischer, the gunner in Panzer 213 who had tracked ships through his sight without permission to fire, was killed in December 1942 near the Chir River in southern Russia. His unit, part of the 6th Panzer Division, was trying to break through to the encircled German forces at Stalingrad. The relief attempt failed. Fischer's tank was hit by a Soviet anti-tank round and brewed up instantly. He was 23 years old. He left behind a series of letters to his fiancée in which he had recorded his growing disillusionment with the conduct of the war. In his final letter, written 3 days before his death, he wrote, "We are told that Stalingrad will fall any day, that the Russians are beaten, that our victory is assured. I remember being told the same thing at Dunkirk. I remember the ships. I do not believe them anymore." The letter reached his fiancée in Hamburg 2 months later, along with his personal effects and the standard notification of a hero's death for Führer and fatherland. The senior commanders fared differently. Gerd von Rundstedt was dismissed by Hitler in July 1944 after the Normandy landings, then recalled in September to preside over the defense of the Rhine, then dismissed again in March 1945 after telling the High Command that the war was lost and that Germany should seek terms. He was captured by the Americans in May 1945, and his heart condition was so severe that his captors initially doubted he would survive interrogation. He did survive. At Nuremberg, he was not charged with war crimes, though his complicity in the crimes of the regime has been a subject of extensive historical debate. In his testimony, he was asked about the halt order. He repeated the same defense he had maintained since 1940. The panzers needed rest. The terrain was unsuitable. Goering had promised to finish the job. He refused to accept personal responsibility, and in a sense, The blame was too widely distributed for any single man to carry. The system had failed, and von Rundstedt was a creature of the system. Heinz Guderian survived the war as well, though his relationship with Hitler had been permanently broken. He served as Chief of the General Staff from July 1944 until March 1945, a period in which he was required to implement orders he knew were catastrophic while navigating the paranoid atmosphere of the Führer's inner circle. In his memoirs, published in the 1950s and widely read in the English-speaking world, he constructed a careful self-portrait as the apolitical professional soldier betrayed by an amateur dictator. The memoirs were enormously influential in shaping the post-war myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the German army had fought honorably and that the atrocities of the regime were the work of the SS and the Nazi Party. This myth has been thoroughly dismantled by historians in recent decades, but it served its purpose for Guderian and his fellow generals. It allowed them to avoid the gallows and to enjoy comfortable retirements as military consultants and memoirists. Hermann Göring was captured by the Americans in May 1945, a bloated, morphine-addicted ruin of the man who had once commanded the skies. At Nuremberg, he was the highest-ranking defendant, and he mounted a vigorous defense, arguing that the trial was Victor's justice and that the Allies had committed crimes of their own. The testimony about the halt order and his boast that the Luftwaffe could destroy the Dunkirk pocket was introduced as evidence of his reckless overconfidence and his role in prolonging the war. He was convicted of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On the night before his execution, he bit a cyanide capsule and died in his cell. How he obtained the capsule remains a mystery. He left a note in which he compared himself to Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who had defeated Rome in battle after battle but lost the war. Adolf Hitler, of course, did not survive the war. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops fought their way into the center of Berlin, he shot himself in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. His body was burned in the garden by his remaining staff. The 1,000-year Reich he had proclaimed in 1933 had lasted 12 years and 3 months. In his final days, according to the testimony of those who were with him, he raged against the German people who had proven unworthy of his leadership, and against the generals who had betrayed his vision. Whether he ever reflected on the moment in May 1940 when he had endorsed the halt order, we cannot know. The last written testament he left, dictated to his secretary Traudl Junge, made no mention of Dunkirk. It was, by then, ancient history. The war had moved on to scales of destruction that made the Flanders pocket look quaint. Stalingrad, Leningrad, Warsaw, Dresden, Hiroshima. The world had learned to kill in numbers that the strategists of 1940 could not have imagined. But history is not made only by the large movements and the big numbers. It is also made by the moments, the hinge points where a different decision would have produced a different world. The halt order at Dunkirk was one of those moments. If the panzers had rolled those final 10 miles, if the British Expeditionary Force had been destroyed or captured in its entirety, the course of the war would have been different in ways that are impossible to fully trace. Britain might have been forced to negotiate. The invasions of North Africa and Italy might not have happened. The Allied return to France might have been delayed or fatally weakened. The Soviet Union might have faced the full weight of the German war machine without the distraction of a Western front. The Holocaust, which was accelerated after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, might have proceeded even more rapidly without the need to divert resources to the Atlantic Wall and the defense of occupied Europe. The consequences spiral outward through every aspect of the mid-20th century, and they all begin at a canal crossing in Flanders, where the engines fell silent and the men in the turrets watched the ships depart. But there is one final dimension to this story that reaches beyond the strategic calculations and the personal memoirs. It is the dimension of what could have been, a question that haunts every historical what-if. The soldiers on the beaches did not know they were living through a hinge of history. They knew they were cold, hungry, terrified, and desperate to survive. The German tank crews who were ordered to halt did not know they would spend the rest of their lives explaining that moment to themselves and to anyone who would listen. The civilians in their little boats did not know they were writing a legend. They simply did what they believed needed to be done, and in the aggregate of those individual actions, the course of the world was altered. The halt order, for all its strategic logic and political calculation, was defeated not by a counter-order from the German High Command, but by the stubborn refusal of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people to accept the fate that had been prepared for them. Every war produces its share of wasted opportunities. What makes Dunkirk unique is that both sides understood almost immediately that an opportunity had been wasted. The British knew they had been given a gift of time that they had no right to expect. The Germans knew they had let a victory of incalculable magnitude slip through their fingers. The recriminations began while the evacuation was still underway and continued for 80 years. The halt order became a stand-in for every argument about the German High Command's competence, about Hitler's meddling, about the role of chance in human affairs. It is discussed in staff colleges, debated by historians, and dramatized in films. But the deeper truth of Dunkirk is not about military strategy. It is about the limits of planning, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the way that small decisions, aggregated across thousands of actors, can overwhelm the grand designs of the powerful. Tonight, you have been inside the German war machine at the moment of its greatest triumph and its most inexplicable failure. You have heard the arguments in the command posts, felt the frustration in the turrets, and seen the smoke rising from the beaches. You have followed the consequences forward through the Battle of Britain, the deserts of North Africa, the beaches of Normandy, and the ruins of Berlin. What remains is the quiet, the long exhale after the story has been told, the space where the mind settles into the weight of what it has absorbed. That is where we are going now. There is a quiet that settles over a battlefield after the armies have moved on. It is not the quiet of peace. It is the quiet of absence, of what was here and is here no longer. The beaches of Dunkirk, in the days after the evacuation, were a landscape of abandonment. The sand was littered with rifles, helmets, gas masks, letters from home, photographs of wives and children, the small talismans that soldiers carry and in their final desperation discard. The Germans who walked those beaches, collecting prisoners and cataloging the debris, found themselves moving through a museum of private loss. One German officer wrote in his report that the sheer volume of abandoned personal effects made it feel as though a city had been disassembled and left behind. He noted, with a kind of clinical curiosity, that many of the letters he found were unopened. Men had carried them through the retreat and the shelling and the waiting in the water, and had never read them. There is a particular kind of historical imagination that is required to bridge the distance between what we know now and what the people in the story knew then. When you stand on the beach at Dunkirk today, on a gray afternoon with the wind coming in off the channel, it is almost impossible to reconcile the quiet promenade with what happened there. The cafes along the waterfront serve coffee and croissants. Families spread blankets on the sand. Children paddle in the shallows. The breakwater, the East Mole, was reconstructed after the war and does not look especially dramatic. But under the surface of the present, the past is always there, waiting. The history is not gone. It is simply dormant, layered beneath the renovations and the forgetfulness that all places accumulate over time. Why does this story continue to grip us 80 years after the event? Part of the answer, I think, is that Dunkirk is a story about the relationship between planning and chance, between the grand designs of powerful men and the stubborn unpredictability of ordinary ones. The German generals had a plan. It was an excellent plan. It had worked with a precision that no previous military operation in history had achieved, and at the moment of its final execution, it was undone by a combination of ego, exhaustion, weather, and the refusal of several 100,000 people to behave as the plan required them to behave. The halt order is often described as a mistake, and it was, but mistakes are not random. They are produced by the systems and the personalities that make them. The German High Command of 1940 was a system designed to produce exactly this kind of mistake, a concentration of authority without accountability, a deference to the leader's intuition over the evidence of the field, a competition between services that rewarded boasting over coordination. The halt order was not an aberration. It was a revelation of the system's essential nature. And yet, for all the strategic analysis we can bring to bear, there is something in the Dunkirk story that resists explanation. It is the thing that happened in the water, as men stood up to their necks waiting for boats that might never come. It is the thing that happened in the little ships, as civilians who had never been shot at crossed a mined strait to rescue soldiers they had never met. It is the thing that happened in the rear guard positions, as French troops who knew they would be captured held their ground so that others might leave. These are not strategic decisions. They are acts of moral commitment in the face of overwhelming evidence that the situation is hopeless. They do not make sense in any calculation of costs and benefits. And yet they happened. And because they happened, the war took a different course. The German soldiers who watched from the canal line also witnessed something that did not fit their understanding of the world. They had been told that their enemy was weak, demoralized, incapable of sustained resistance. But what they saw through their field glasses was an army that, however battered and exhausted, was not broken. It was orderly. It was patient. It was getting away. The propaganda would later spin this as a rout, but the men who were actually there knew better. They had seen the lines in the water. They had seen the discipline under fire. They had seen what their own command had insisted was impossible. The legacy of Dunkirk is not just about the war. It is about how we understand failure and success, how we assign credit and blame, how we construct the stories we tell about our own past. The British took Dunkirk and made it a national myth of resilience, which it was, but also a myth of triumph, which it was not. Churchill was careful to say that wars are not won by evacuations, but the emotional force of the story quickly overwhelmed that caution. The little ships became a symbol that substituted for the more complicated, more painful reality of a catastrophic defeat that had been narrowly survived. The German version of the story is equally instructive. The halt order became the preferred explanation for every German general who needed to explain why the war was lost. It was Hitler's interference, Göring's boasting, von Rundstedt's caution, any factor that did not require the generals to examine their own complicity in the disaster. The blame game provided a convenient escape from the harder question. Why had the German command structure, which had just achieved the most spectacular victory in modern military history, produced a failure of this magnitude? History does not offer neat resolutions. The halt order remains contested because the evidence allows multiple interpretations. The motivations of the key actors were mixed and sometimes unknowable. The documents tell us what was written, but not always what was meant. The memoirs were written after the fact by men with reputations to protect and scores to settle. The witnesses are now almost all gone. What remains is the event itself, irreducible and demanding, asking us to think carefully about power, about chance, about the choices that shape the lives of millions. If you have made it this far into the night, you are probably someone who understands that the past is not finished with us. It is not a closed book sitting on a shelf. It is more like a tide rising and falling, revealing new shapes in the sand each time it withdraws. The story of Dunkirk, and of the German commanders who watched their greatest victory slip away, will be told again, by other voices, in other times, and each retelling will find something new in the old material. That is how history works. It is not a fixed record. It is a conversation that continues. As you settle into the quiet of wherever you are listening, maybe already half asleep, spare a thought for the men on both sides who lived through those days in May and June of 1940. Not the generals with their maps and their memoirs, but the ordinary soldiers. The German tank gunner who tracked ships through his gun sight and never fired. The British infantryman who stood in the water for hours, shivering, watching the horizon for a boat. The French rearguard soldier who knew he would not escape but held his position anyway. The civilian sailor who steered his little boat through the minefields because someone had asked him to. They are all gone now, all of them, passed into the silence that eventually claims every witness. But for a few hours tonight, their story has been alive again in your mind. And that, in the end, is what we can offer them. Not judgment, not resolution. Just the simple act of remembering, in the dark, while the rest of the world sleeps. If you enjoyed drifting off to this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it ensures you will be here when the next story begins. Drop a comment letting me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I read them, and they never fail to remind me how strange and lovely it is that people all over the world are falling asleep to the same words at the same moment. For now, though, the story is done. The ships have reached England. The panzers have fallen silent. The smoke over Dunkirk has drifted out across the channel and dissolved into the night. And you can let go of the history, let it recede into the place where dreams are made, and allow yourself to rest. There will be more stories tomorrow. But for now, sleep well.